Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to see if my audio is okay. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Good morning, everyone. My clock just hit 8 o'clock. It is time to begin. I want to thank everyone for being here in attendance on Zoom and as a reminder, today we're going to focus on the amended 22 budget, HB 910. I would also like to emphasize Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now? Shake your head, Abby. Okay. I don't know what in the world just happened, but I'm staying at the Georgia Tech Hotel, so these things absolutely should not happen. Thank you for joining us today. So we will get started. We're going to look at the amended 22 budget, HB 910. I want to emphasize, as a general rule, the Rules Committee meets at 9 a.m. in our appropriations room. So we're going to practice being a good host and have good manners, and we're going to be through before then. So before we get started, I'm going to call on my good friend, Dominic Laricchia, to open us in prayer. Dominic.
Pray. Heavenly Father God, we love you. Thank you for this day, God. Thank you for all the blessings. Just be with us during this time, guide and direct us as we do the business of the people of this great state. And God, that we would do it in a way that would best serve the people and honor you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Okay. Before I turn it over to our first presenter, I want to emphasize, and as the next presenter comes up, he's going to talk about buckets of funds. And I want to emphasize to the committee that we have just a few buckets of funding sources that we use to fund all transportation in the state of Georgia. The first is motor fuels. It's a big bucket. And second, we have federal dollars that come down for us. And thirdly, we have what we now call transportation trust funds. We used to call them transportation fees, which is the $5 hotel motel that fee that I pay every night at the hotel that I'm staying in here. Heavy vehicle fee, electric vehicle fee. The fourth bucket is what we now call Georgia Transit Trust Funds, which is the rideshare fee, the 50-cent Uber Lyft fee that we see. And the last bucket that we have that we pull funds from to fund our roads and bridges and transit and airports in this great state is state appropriations. So the first person they're going to have talk to us today, and I do thank you for being here, is Chris Tomlinson of I don't know, CERTA, ATL. I don't know which hat you got on. I can't really see that well. So I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a second as we get our slides ready. Members of the committee, what I thought I would do this morning is go through the specifics of the governor's amended budget as it relates to the State Road and Tellway Authority, or SRTA, Georgia Regional Transportation Authority, aka GRETA, and the ATL. And then I will give brief comments and happy to take questions about the rideshare fees. So I'd like to start with GRETA. So as you can see, the only change in the amended 22 budget as it relates to GRETA is the governor's recommendation to include $6,554 for the statewide adjustment related to the pay increases for employees. Those funds would go towards increases for 2.25 full-time equivalent positions. I know that seems like a weird amount, but please keep in mind that the three authorities have a matrix organization and some of the positions are split funded. So it's really two positions plus a portion of a third position. We are continuing to work with Office of Planning and Budget to make sure that the recommended number is the appropriate number once you factor in positions that are also partially funded with federal funds. So we may be coming back to you and continue to talk with OPB about some slight adjustments. Turning next to the ATL. Again, the recommended change in the budget is related to the $5,000 pay increase for employees. You'll see that amount at $68,161. Again, it's really the same thing. As the chairman pointed out, we have a mix of state funds as well as federal funds. So that you know that the adjustments are related to 28 positions for the ATL. And as I mentioned, some of these are split funded between state and federal dollars. 9 of those positions work in our planning function, and 19 of those positions work in our express operations, our express commuter bus. Next slide. Speaking a little bit about express, I just want to bring you up to speed on some key factors. On your screen, what you will see that was parked in front of the Capitol is a demo bus of our new all-electric vehicles. We'll be adding, we'll be replacing 10 vehicles in our 166 coach fleet with 10 all-electric buses within approximately 12 months' time. If you're not familiar with Express, we run 27 different routes out of 27 different park and rides, which are spread across 12 metro Atlanta counties. And while trips were lagging during the pandemic, we have seen significant increases in 2020. And I'm proud to say that throughout the entire pandemic, we have been able to maintain and run at least one morning and one afternoon run on every single route. So even though we had to reduce service, we maintained service on all of the routes. Also related to transit, I just want to take a moment to point out some collaborative work that the ATL is doing with our partners at GDOT, ARC, as well as Cobb, Gwinnett, Fulton, and DeKalb counties, and the Regional Commission. All of those jurisdictions have approved entering into a joint funding and collaboration MOU, which will move forward with a collaborative design effort to explore the addition of transit on the express lanes that are planned for 285. You'll hear more about this over the next upcoming weeks and months, but I wanted to talk about it while I was still talking about the transit components. Last but not least, turning to the State Road and Tellway Authority, you'll see there are no recommended changes. State Road and Tellway Authority employees are paid through toll revenues as opposed to appropriated dollars. If any of the certain employees are listening, we are working to do the calculations so that we can be consistent with the proposed recommendations of the governor to provide salary adjustments. And we plan to do so accordingly, depending on what ultimately passes as the final budget. I would be remiss if I ever came before any of the committees and talked about tolling and not talk a little bit about the performance of our toll system. So on the left, you can see a color-coded map that shows the 4 different projects that we operate between I-85, I-75 South Metro, the Northwest Corridor project, and the extension to the original I-85 project. On the right of your screen, you will see that for the fiscal year 21, we had about 18.5 million trips. Fiscal year 21 is a year that was clearly affected by COVID, and we saw a substantial dip. But starting as early as March, you can see that trips had started to recover even that early in the pandemic. This slide gives you a comparison of trips in both 2020, 2021, and the dashed line is our pre-pandemic levels in 2019. The takeaway from this is that I'm pleased to report that trips have essentially recovered to their pre-pandemic level. We're seeing a very different mix of traffic. It's not all commuter traffic. Out in the corridors, we're seeing a much higher amount of commercial traffic or freight traffic, the Amazon delivery trucks. But unfortunately, as many of you have experienced, we have seen increases in congestion and a corresponding return to people utilizing the express lanes in order to have a consistent, faster, and more reliable trip. Next slide. The last program I want to mention, and there are no changes in the amended budget, is our Gtip program. First off, I want to thank members of the committee and the General Assembly for restoring the funding levels in last year's budget. That has allowed us to move forward with a new round of Gtip awards, which are currently under evaluation. But coupled with the approximately $13 million that appears in the big budget each year, as well as remaining funds and interest, we have up to $15 million available for the current round, which I believe is the 9th round of funding. Again, if you're not familiar with Gtip, this allows local projects that will have a significant economic development impact to either be accelerated or close their funding gaps to move forward. I suspect that I'll be in front of committees before the end of this session to talk again about some of the specific projects that are under consideration, as well as some of the successes from awards in years past. Mr. Chairman, as you can see, for the 3 authorities in the amended budget, the only changes are really related to CERTA and Greta, and that is related to the proposed increases for employees. I'm happy to take any questions on those budgets, and after that, I'll be happy to also take questions or provide some comments on ride shares.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I will say my video keeps going in and out here. So if I happen to turn my video off, and maybe that would help. So if I happen to leave, I have a very capable vice chair in the room, Rick Williams, that you might need to take over if I lose a signal. I think Representative Billy Mitchell has his button requesting a question.
Or two. obviously MARTA is very important to the constituency that I serve, being that they are in DeKalb County. If I may, Mr. Chair, ask a question or two. What are, Mr. Thomason, what are the projects that the ATL has identified for funding with the Transit Trust Fund?
Thank you for the question. We have, well, two things. One, the ATL each year submits a list of priority project investments, projects that we think would move the needle in the region on the list, and that is due to the Office of Planning and Budget, the Speaker of the House, the Lieutenant Governor's Office, and the Governor's Office on September 1 of every year. So the list that we turned in had 17 projects throughout the metro area, and I can provide you a list of those specifics. There were, I believe, 5 MARTA projects. But to bring it down to a more, I guess, manageable list, we have been working closely with MARTA and on a recommendation related to their station rehab program. The recommendation from the ATL perspective was focused on the 5-point station. All of the station rehab is important. Very pleased to announce that they recently kicked off the Indian Creek rehab project already in DeKalb County. 5 points, no slight to DeKalb at all. We're glad that MARTA already has momentum. 5 points was identified by the ATL because of its strong ties to economic development, the convention business, and some of the major events that are coming up in the near future, including hosting World Cup events.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Okay.
Great.
I was going to say there were 2 other projects specifically that we were focused on in the near term. One is a Cumberland Transfer Center in Cobb. And the third project is a Gwinnett Transfer Center project. And specifically for the rideshare funds, and for our purposes, I'm about to talk across AFY 22, where there's approximately $9.8 million available, and FY 23, which is 15.9. So across the amended and the big budget, there's $25.8 million in rideshare fees. The reason that they weren't in my presentation is the governor's recommended budget has all of that going into the trust funds that the chairman mentioned. And so I believe you'll hear from GDOT about that, since those trust funds go through their budget.
Wow. Trying to understand that the Gwinnett Transfer Center project, as you mentioned, is that project a Gwinnett County Transit project or Atlanta Region Transit Link Authority project?
Yes, it is a Gwinnett Transit project. The Atlanta region, the ATL, because we do not normally serve as a project sponsor for the major projects. Rather, we work with the sponsors, MARTA, GCT, CCT or Cobb Link, and we provide recommendations based on the projects that are going to be either built or operated by those operators.
Wow, interesting. Mr. Chair, if I may, the ATL.
This will need to be your last one. We need to move on.
Okay. The ATL's ARTP is the project what you would call regionally significant?
Yes. All 3 of those projects that we would consider regionally significant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we get another opportunity, I have another question, if time allows.
Okay, I know that Chris has got a pretty hard meeting he's got to get to. I would encourage you to go offline and get with him. If you have trouble, if you'll come through me, we'll absolutely arrange a meeting to get the questions that you have answered. But thank you for your question. Are there other questions for Chris in the room? Seeing none, thank you for being here. We'll turn it over now to Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you know, I have jury duty, so I'll drop off. Representative Mitchell, I'll make sure I reach out through my office today, since I'll be in court for jury duty, but happy to follow up with you on your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Russell Whitberg, GDOT.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be with the subcommittee this morning and go through the amended FY22. And we'll, in view of time, I'm going to go pretty quick. This is a little bit of a rehash of what I provided to the Joint Appropriations Committee last week. So next slide, please. I'm going to start a little bit with, the chairman mentioned buckets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal infrastructure bill because it is significant, and we want to take a little bit of time just again to continue to educate and wrap our minds around it. So a $1.2 trillion IIJA, or bipartisan infrastructure law, that was passed. This slide shows you sort of the breakdown, and I think it's important to you, Mr. Chairman, that you notice that under the non-transportation, there's a lot of investment in broadband investment. So there has been a tremendous amount either through the American Rescue Plan dollars that have already come down to Georgia, and then here's some other dollars nationally, obviously for broadband expansion under the non-transportation. That will not be administered by USDOT. On the transportation side, the side that we deal with is under the USDOT, $567 billion for transportation nationally. And this is over 5 years. So this is a 5-year funding bill at the federal level. Next slide, please. So the chairman talked about buckets, and I like to group the IIJA into 4 major buckets and talk about those. And I'll get into the first 2 buckets, the existing formula programs. Those are formulaic dollars that come to every state, which is very good because they're dependable. You know what those dollars are. You can plan and move around those. The IIJA also created new federal programs or new buckets of federal dollars, and I'll talk about what those are. The blue bucket is discretionary. So a big part of the IIJA had 39 new discretionary programs at almost $83 billion. Those are programs that each state, city, and county can compete for to try to draw down some of that almost $83 billion. To give you some perspective for those discretionary type programs, there's programs for bridge investment at $9.2 billion. There's one that's really interesting. It's the National Infrastructure Project Assistance at $5 billion. Those are for major projects that may be by state or so big that you couldn't fund them out of one state. So if you think about border crossings, you think about some of the big bridges that had troubles over this last year, the Brent Spence Bridge or I-40 up in Memphis area, those kind of big national interest projects. And there's one, a discretionary program called Safe Streets for Roads and All, which is focused on reducing pedestrian fatalities, bike fatalities, and we've seen a tremendous increase in fatalities, especially from pedestrian or non-motorized users. So, and then there's multiple other programs, discretionary programs that we can compete for. In the last bucket, the orange bucket over there, I guess that's a Home Depot bucket, policy and programming items. And the IIJA codified the one federal decision, which is an environmental streamlining process where there's a lead federal agency that takes control of it, going through all the other federal agencies. In our case, it would be either the Federal Highway Administration or the Federal Transit Administration that would take the lead through the environmental process, through a federal environmental process. And they have shot clocks and time limits to make sure they get their approvals done, which gives certainty again, which is a really good thing. There was a mileage-based user fee national study too that's included in there to talk about how do you look at transportation revenue going forward as there are more and more electric vehicles on our roadways, which obviously erode the buying power of the federal excise tax that generates highway trust fund dollars that fills these buckets, that fill the buckets up there. So a lot going on. So next slide, we'll boil it down to what it means to Georgia. And it's again, one of the biggest sort of misconceptions out there, this is all new money on top of what we have. Fundamentally, it is a transportation reauthorization, which is a 5-year federal funding bill that establishes each year what the funding levels are to the nation and then ultimately to the states. This table is Georgia specific related to the Highway Trust Fund, the Federal Highway Trust Fund. So this is the next 5 years. What's really unique about the IIJA was the funding level in the first year bumped 20%. And that's significant. Usually transportation bills sort of ramped up year by year and stepped up gradually to get the ultimate. That you go to 20, in this case, 21%. And then each year after that, a 2% growth factor is applied to that. So ultimately to Georgia from Highway Trust Fund, $8.9 billion over 5 years, which is robust. And I always like to remind people that, you have to match these dollars and the federal program is reimbursable. So we use Georgia dollars first, pay for the work, seek a federal reimbursement. And I'll come back to that because we're in an interesting time as it relates to reimbursements at the moment. And so the leverage is good for the federal. You leverage 20% state dollars or local dollars to get the 80% on the dollar return federally. The next slide, please. This sort of takes a look at what that 5-year additional match requirement is, $431 million roughly. And these numbers are approximated. They may vary year to year just a little bit, but you can see what the additional match requirements are to go toward surface transportation top dollars. And then the bottom line there across this row is what's needed for intermodal or non-surface transportation, things like FTA, FAA, FRA, those other federal agencies beside federal highways. So this shows you sort of the scale of what it looks like over time, because those are, when you think about a 20% increase at the federal level initially, well, our state budget didn't quite increase by 20%. So there's a little bit of a delta there that has to be overcome to provide the match. And so we certainly have to leverage our state dollars first to leverage the federal. Next slide, please. Without getting into too many details, these are smaller buckets of the big buckets. So the blue table there is the first category, the existing programs that existed. And it gives you a scale by how much some increased and some, we only had one that had no increase and had one that slightly decreased. So you can see there's significant more dollars in these sub buckets of the existing programs. Now, the yellow bucket I showed you was the new programs, and that's what the yellow tables are. There's 4 new programs, carbon reduction at $41 million in this first year, which is a focusing on reduction in greenhouse gas. So these would be projects that are non-motorized focused, things that would have an ultimate reduction in greenhouse gases. So more information on that to come. Protect is dealing with resiliency. And a lot of that is like coastal, think about hurricane evacuation routes, things like that fall in there. Hardening infrastructure, maybe where you have a place that routinely floods and there's infrastructure that needs to be upgraded or reconstructed to lessen those environmental impacts. The bottom 2 there are not funded under the Highway Trust Fund. The bridge, poor and fair condition rehab, $45 million. Is focused on bridges that are deemed poor or fair condition to be either replaced or rehabbed. And a subcomponent of that is 15% of those dollars have to go to a local bridge that is not on a roadway that is federally eligible. So this is a really good thing to focus, as Georgia has focused on city and county bridges where we've done that with state dollars. This gives us some flexibility to leverage federal dollars to work on those local bridges. And the 15% is a minimum. There's another little bonus in that 15% of those dollars is there requires 0 federal match. So that's a good thing too. So we are certainly working through that now to understand. We got the rules of this Friday a week ago. So we're running through all the rules that came out federally about what bridges these may be for the state. So this is certainly a good program. The last one there, certainly we want to talk about the electric vehicle charging infrastructure with a national focus on deploying EV chargers around the nation and the state. Obviously, Georgia is in the EV business big time with Rivian and Helix and some other Bluebird school buses being in the EV business. So We expect some guidance from Federal Highway next month to help understand how you deploy and utilize these dollars. Next slide, please. Move into transit, move away from surface transportation and move into transit. You can see a very big plus up, 27, almost 28% in the first year. The largest share of that goes back to the ATL and MARTA federally for the urbanized grant formula funds. That was an increase by 30%. The good news is the rural formula grants increased by about 30% as well. And there was 10 new competitive discretionary programs as well. So again, be able to compete for those dollars. So anyway, the lion's share of the 260 goes to the big transit providers, MARTA, Gwinnett, Cobb, et cetera. So good news there as well. Next slide is aviation, always a popular topic, and certainly had a great commission focused on aviation this last calendar year. We estimate that you can see about $77 million coming in federally. The IIJA added about $30 million to the previous federal aviation appropriation, which was about $47 million. So this is additive. So IIJA added dollars over time. The 2018 appropriation actually runs out, I believe, in fiscal year 23, federal fiscal year 23. So again, Georgia is a state block grant dollar. So most of these dollars actually go out to the airports by formula amount. The lowest was about 110,000 to the highest, which is 5.4 million that went to Savannah Hilton Head by formula. And then there's a 5% local match. There's a 5% state match of that. So a 5% state match is about $4.4 million to match those. And that goes directly out to the airports. Now with FAA dollars, you're always competing for other funding. We have a state, and we'll get into the budget, we have a state funded aviation program, and the local airport authorities and GDOT can compete for additional and pull down additional FAA dollars. We just can't quantify what those are because you don't know until you apply and see what you can get, but we always do pretty well there. Next slide, please. Let me jump into this. This is a complicated slide, but it's when I mentioned I'd come back to the funding a minute ago. The IIJA has not been fully funded yet. Congress is working through a continuing resolution. There's been two that got us to February 18th. They basically give you a daily pro rata share of your federal allotment. So to date, we can pull down $464 million up through February 18th. I'll remind you, that's $464 million out of $1.7 billion. So we are very interested to see what happens on February as it relates to fully funding the IIJA. The graphic on the bottom is a very complicated graphic, and I'll just talk through it for a moment. Is that we have always lined up our state budget and our federal budget year to be the same. So we marry our federal budget year to our state budget year and always try to utilize our federal dollars on the state budget year so that we can go capture additional federal dollars that don't get used. In August, Federal Highway always looks out to see who's not using their dollars around the state, and they redistribute dollars to states. We've always been very fortunate by doing that and drawing down additional dollars, approximately $100 million often. And so that's a really good thing. With the uncertainty of the federal funding, I might add that USDOT and Federal Highway and the other modal agencies can't develop these new programs yet because they're not funded. So the carbon reduction, the protect, those are programs that can't move forward. The discretionary programs can't move forward until they're fully funded. We get into a little bit of a lurch situation here between the state fiscal year and the federal fiscal year of these additional federal dollars, which we won't be able to capture in the state budget year. So there's going to be federal dollars available that are in federal 22, but we will be moving into state 23. And so that's going to get us a little bit out of balance. I'll tell you that it sort of goes back to that match component. So we'll have to put more dollars toward match in 23 than we will in 22, which just shuffles our programs a little bit. And we'll continue, Mr. Chairman, and we'll certainly be talking to the House Transportation Committee of what that means as well as we find out what happens on February 18th. The other thing I remind you is like I say, we pay it forward right now. We're still moving federal projects forward. We haven't stopped federal projects, but in the absence of a full year appropriation, we'll have to throttle back what we can basically bid probably starting in April. So this February 18th will be a very important date. So we'll see where that goes. Next slide, please. And this I went over this in great detail, but I can't say enough about our men and women at GDOT of what they do. We're trying to build back our bench strength. Need to get back closer to 4,000 employees. We're at 3,637. The criticality of that is responding to emergencies. When we have a hurricane, when we had that foul letter word, last week of snow and ice, those are things that take a statewide response. We move people from Tifton, from Jessup, from South Georgia, all the way here to Metro Atlanta to be ready if we had an ice event that covered most of Metro Atlanta and north. So we've got to build that bench strength back. And then the last bottom left table there, I highlight is in 2019, from 0 to 10 years, was only 18% of our workforce. Now it's 56% of our workforce. So a very young workforce. We need to develop that bench strength, get people back and retain them, which plays into our budget. So next slide, we'll jump into the budget real quick. So this is the revenue adjustments that were added. So basically the transportation fees or the trust funds that Chairman Perkle mentioned increased by $56 million over our base. If you look at that second row there, moving fees to $186 million, you can see the rideshare fee that Chris Tomlinson talked about now totals about 17.5. There was a $9.88 million add there. And then there's a $1 million add for general funds, which actually supports leveraging federal dollars to replace the ferry that DNR operates at Sapelo Island. So that's what the $1 million is. The Greta comes out of transportation revenues that go over to DCA, to Chris's budget, to support Greta that he just showed you. So that brings our amended total to $2.166 billion. The next slide is just a representation of where those dollars are generally used. We've collapsed our budget programs that you have in your track document to really show you where the dollars are going. The biggest column, obviously, is 46% is going into our capital projects. That's capital construction, capital maintenance, and helping to deliver local projects. The next biggest bucket is the routine maintenance. That's the men and women that are working on the roadways, taking care of our infrastructure and our contracting. As a matter of fact, we contract about 50% all that out now of work. So that's a big part of contracting, of routine preventative maintenance activities. Certainly goes into, hurricane response, snow and ice response, those kind of things as well. The next big bucket too is LMIG, 10% of excise. So that's where that is at. And then you can see the distribution. General operations is 5 of our budget programs that you have on your track sheet, all collapsed. It totals about 11%. So that's everything from delivering the project to the administrative function or just running the department. All right, let's move to the next table. And this will sort of correspond with your track sheet if you want to follow along. First thing we have is we've taken this table and we've been specific to the buckets Chairman Perkle talked about. Either there's some motor fuel, a transportation trust fund, or a transit trust fund. So the second column tells you what the flavor of the money is or what the bucket of the money is. So you can see GO bond debt, really no change there with the motor fuel and the fee component going to bond debt. The next one is capital construction, and you'll see a minus $16 million from motor fuel, and that minus $16 million is redistributed through the other programs to help with recruitment and retention and salaries that we ask OPB for help with. And I want to thank OPB for acknowledging that to help try to build back that bench strength I've talked about. So that's where that 16 million is distributed among the other programs that have personnel in them. And I'll just go through those very quickly. So you can see there's a deduct of 16 million from our capital program, but the add of the $55.9 million in transportation fees or trust fund add it back, which brought our total capital construction to state budget to $936.9 million. So just short of $1 billion. Capital maintenance, there's no change in. The program delivery, data collections, departmental admin are all redistribution of trying to, again, help with recruitment and retention of employees. And then planning is, again, the same purpose there. So when you see that table, that's what what the redistribution of the 16 million is. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to build that bench strength back and try to get people in the door to the department. The next slide is continuation of routine maintenance. There was a $10.4 million add there. That again for recruitment and retention purposes. And then traffic management is the same. That's when you see that table. Now let me move into intermodal. We broke intermodal out separately because they are the transportation trust fund dollars, some state general fund, and the ride share. And you can see the break of that. The total intermodal budget totals about $42.6 million. You can see how those are broken down by the buckets there. So the ride share fee to Christopher Thomason's presentation, out of the ride share fee, about $4 million is will be directed to the ATL for their use. That's why it didn't show up in his budget. It's shown here. And then the balance of that we're using to promote the rural transit work that was previously done to enhance rural transit. That's making some investments in Albany and helping deploy more vehicles, about 10 new vehicles down in the southern part of the state to provide expanded coverage for transit in the rural area, and also helping with Macon expand their fleet and probably do some electrification of their fleet. So that's where that is. The biggest share of the intermodal budget is in airport aid. About 16.3 million of that total is going to airport aid in general. So that's the biggest share of that. And then there is actually in your track sheet, you can see that there is the $5,000 referenced in there as well. Let me see what page that's on. Or you guys are, I hope you're tracking on your sheet. I'm trying to flip through it.
Commissioner, I see that on my sheet, but I'll be honest with you, as I look through the budget, I saw it in a lot of places in the fiscal year 22, all over our 400-page budget book, but I didn't see it much in your budget. I saw the retention verbiage, but I did not see the $5,000. Can you talk about that for just a second?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. You are correct. The $5,000 in the amended 22 was not called out specifically. This is something we'll work with. What we have in that other retention and recruitment buckets doesn't fill the $5,000. So we'll have to be working with you guys moving forward to try to figure out how we redistribute some dollars out of our capital programs to try to cover that $5,000 increase in amended 22. So what you see there was sort of what again, I'm very thankful for OPB acknowledging, filling critical vacancies and the like. And we're trying to get our entry level pay to $15 an hour. We're at $12.55. It's hard to recruit anybody to do hard work at $12.55 in this environment. So those are the things we have. We'll have to work moving forward to see how what needs to be redistributed into each of the categories that have people in them that I went through, Mr. Chairman. So you're right, it does not show up as a line item. We'll have to work to generate that so that our employees can enjoy the $5,000 increase if that moves forward through the appropriations process.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off before you finished up your presentation? Or are you done? I've got
one more quick slide, but
okay.
Chris Thomason has just went over them. They were in the payments to CERTA. A big part of the payment to CERTA is debt. That is the largest part of that is paying debt down. And then the payments to the ATL, again, $12.8 million in transportation trust fund going over for their operations. But those numbers marry up to what Chris just presented to you. So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes the presentation. I look forward to any of your questions and comments.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chairman Rick Jaspers.
On, I'm on. Okay, thank you. Didn't light up here. Chairman Perkle and Commissioner, I guess my question is this, you just addressed it. Look at the $5,000 per employee is not in the tracking sheet. And then the comment, Commissioner, you made about matching funds not being there, and there would be, seems like this would have some effect on some local project work, down the road for us.
Yes, sir, Chairman, it's a good story, right? So if you can leverage 20% of your dollars or 20% to get 80 cents, that's a good leverage. We'll have to reevaluate our capital programs that are solely what we call HB 170 funded.
Right.
And so we'll have to take some of the dollars from those programs to match the additional federal. So, so it's a rising tide. I always like to talk about that. The tide is rising, but we have to rearrange what we're doing and what we're advancing from the state funds to match the federal funds. And you want to get that leverage. I mean, that's always a good deal to leverage. So that's something that we'll have to work forward with to see what that is. And that complicated slide I showed you about timing really matters about where we are when Congress fully authorizes the federal dollars that we can draw on and where we are. It looks like we're going to probably be in budget year 23 and would still be in federal budget year 22 to try to leverage those dollars, which gives us a little bit of a compounding challenge into 23 that we'll have to match even more federal in our state budget year 23, because we've got part of 22, because it doesn't look like by the time these programs get underway, we're gonna have to leverage if you go back to the one slide I had of the match, it would be what we show in 22 and 23 added together to match, which could have a compounding, and I'll caveat that it's all about timing, could have a compounding effect of the impact in state budget year 23, meaning that we'd have to reshuffle our deck on our state funded projects. It's extremely complicated in the timing and delivery of these things, of how we deliver projects.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I look forward to talking a little bit more about the $5,000 thing. I want to understand that better.
Yes, sir. I'd be glad to.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. And that's one thing, and if we could just put a pin in this one right here, that a concern that I have is of all the new monies that are added to our budget for fiscal year amended 22 does not equal the match on that one screen that you showed of the $71.2 million or whatever that it was. So, 1 to 4 is a pretty doggone good match if those will sync up with some of our projects. And so just the concerns, and I know that you're addressing those, but I just wanted to show the concern. I have Vance Smith had a question. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, you mentioned early on, and you mentioned something that just stuck in my head, mileage-based fee. You're in constant contact with Federal Highway, and you hear what's going on. Is there much of a push for that, or what? I hate to ask you to speculate, but what do you see, because we are going to electric EV vehicles? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Representative Smith. Certainly, that is the focus, and there have been some previous work done federally to look nationally at how do you replace the Highway Trust Fund, which is based on excise, which hadn't been adjusted since 1993, I believe, federally. And so there's different ways to look at that, but the sort of the school of thought now is, you pay for what you use, which makes a lot of sense. But how do you capture that is the challenging part. I mean, there's a lot of things wrapped around that based on how do you know where you go. The other thing is especially interstate, as you move, if you're traveling from Miami to New York, you go through a lot of states. Traditionally now you stop and you fill up in those states. So if you're charging your vehicle in multiple other states, you only get recognized nationally, those dollars and those miles don't equate to where you would traditionally revenue would be generated in each state you stopped and filled up. That may not be the case. So there's a lot of those nuances that have to be worked out. Nationally, there is probably 4 to 5 major studies that are going on sort of in states that are looking at how do you do this. We've asked to join on the East Coast Transportation Coalition to join a future pilot of where they've already been sort of piloting around this mileage-based user fee up in the Northeast. And so we're going to try to tag on to that to see what we can learn about it. Because again, there is the erosion and just with fuel efficiency too. Motor fuel just does not provide the revenue that it used to, even due to fuel efficiency. So that's what's going on. It's hard to speculate. There's so many different approaches, and these pilots that have been done are pretty small. 2 to 2,000, maybe 5,000 vehicles. So scale and trying to capture that is and understand miles driven by a car. I think Georgia's got how many cars we've got. It's almost, I think it's equal to population, pretty close. So, that's a lot to keep up with. So we'll keep you in tune. And it's good though that they've addressed it nationally, because states are looking at it, thinking about it, but nationally it needs to be thought about as well.
Representative Mitchell. Billy Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I can do this in one question. I understand that GDOT provides the local matching funding for rural transit agencies and to draw down federal formula funds. And that funding has come from sources other than the general fund in previous years, is my understanding. And I always thought that the purpose of the Transit Trust Fund was to spend more state funding on transit, not free up general funding. Is that accurate?
Well, let me go back. So on non-urban, being outside the ATL, for rural transit and even small urban transit, the state does not match that. That is all local match. So the locals are drawing down the funds. It's up to the state. We administer the FTA funds for small urban and rural transit, as the ATL administers for urban transit. So the rideshare fees was the catalyst to put Georgia dollars toward those. So we're certainly glad to have these dollars now that will help expand transit, but it's not going toward operations. And as Mr. Tomlinson talked about, these are more capital projects. So it still is up to local governments or MARTA to provide that matching dollar amount. So the things I articulated are still sort of capital in nature, but the one down in South Georgia we're talking about is trying to get 10 new vehicles so that we can have better coverage of and that capital is the hard part. That's the big lift. And so that's where that is. But those transit trust funds certainly were dollars dedicated to do good things for transit in Georgia, and we're glad to have those as such.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Last question. Representative Dominic LaRicchia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Chairman Perkle said he recognized Russell, I looked around the room to see who he was talking about, because I say Commissioner McMurray. So, but
Russell is fine.
Thank you so much for what you do. And you know this, that we just came through the very difficult task of reapportionment in this state. And in particular in rural Georgia, where we lose population every 10 years and more of the representation of this state goes to these higher populated metro areas. What I would ask you to do on behalf of rural Georgia is to really look forward and think outside the box into transportation investment. I'm one of the believers that transportation is an area where if you build it, they will come. Where Chairman Perkle and I live, it's Highway 32, over Highway 221, Highway 82, 84 from Valdosta, over all the way to the ports and those kinds of things. And so if we don't start looking today, as we appropriate the millions or billions of dollars that we'll invest in transportation, to 4-lane and 441 from the North State line to Florida, and Highway 32 and 158, 135, 221, these state routes, you're going to keep getting more congestion and more population in these metro areas. So my ask, just to kind of recap, is for you and our board members to really think outside the box into future transportation investment into these more rural areas, to make it easier for industries to get their products from point A to point B and have more job opportunities and help us at least be sustainable in the next. I didn't realize how fast 10 years goes by
No kidding.
until I was elected. And so y'all do a fantastic job. Y'all are so responsive to us as we have needs, but I think moving forward that we really need to look at additional investment and benefits in the area of transportation to kind of level the playing field with who we're competing against in Atlanta. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will, let me just respond to that very briefly. As one, I want to just give a big shout out to Janine Miller, the governor's planning director at the department, because she is very laser focused on that and the balance of the entire state. I mean, the metropolitan, what we have here with congestion and mobility, and there's a lot of good things here in the IGA that will help that, but also the focus on rural Georgia and moving freight and goods. And as we know, agribusiness is our #1 economy. So those things are critical, and she's got that vision. She's working now through a freight and logistics plan that will address a lot of those corridors, especially as it relates to agribusiness, but also developing the next step, as we call it, the next 4-year fiscally constrained program that is required by federal law in taking a strategic vision to address the things you just talked about. And I remind this subcommittee too, that we have congressional district balancing in play so that dollars are equally used across the state over a 5-year window, at least to 85% balance year to year, to make sure that there is equity among all congressional districts that you started your question with reapportionment and looking at that. So those come into play as well. You go through the planning process, you balance those things out to make sure that investment is made throughout this entire great state.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for the question, Representative LaRicchia. Commissioner, I apologize if I was less than formal in my remarks to you. Did not mean it as a slight.
No problem.
In one bit. But thank you for being here. Seeing no further questions, we stand adjourned. Thank you.